Hey, well, hello everybody. It's so good to be back. As most of you know, I've been gone for about a month, a little over a month. Um, I was on a residency for a month at a chance center down in Florida, which was really worthwhile, really good experience. And I come back from that thinking it will be really useful because there's Chan, there's the insight stuff, there's the Pali Canon and Thai forest, there's all these different traditions. I come back thinking it might be useful to just reground on some of the basics of this diversity of Buddhist teaching, not with a view to getting remotely intellectual about it, but just to ground on the diversity and some of where it comes from, much of which is really um, contextual, the time and the place for the arising of particular teachings, and then bring that forward to today and say, so why does that matter? What does that leave us with? And how do we use the teachings today? And why do we use the teachings today? So that's the trajectory that I want to cover today. I'll start with just, what Buddha taught. Buddha lived in northern India 2,500 years ago, and he experienced in his own life, and then looking at people around him, that he was suffering. He was experiencing this thing he called dukkha, which is discontent, dis-ease, something's a little off kilter, vexation, stress, basically not being comfortable, not being happy, not being content and at ease. And he realized that was not the way he wanted to live his life. And he was firmly of the belief that there was a way to end that, to come to a place of ease, of freedom. So that's what Buddha's practice was. When he found that freedom, he came back to teach how to realize that freedom ourselves, how everybody can realize that freedom. So that's a universal truth, the truth of our dukkha. And we have a particular flavor for it in this time and place, which I'll get to later. But we in the US today have a particular flavor of that dukkha, which is cultural and contextual and affects how we look at the teachings. Importantly, Buddha was teaching freedom. He wasn't teaching, this is the way the world works. This is how time and space work. This is how candles and refrigerators and computers work. He wasn't teaching any of that stuff. Buddhist teaching has no bearing on that at all. It actually aligns and fits very well with quantum theory and emerging space and time physics and so forth. So it does happen to fit with that, but that's not what the teaching is about. The teaching is entirely practical, pragmatic. How can we be at ease? How can we be at peace? How can we be useful in the world, helping other people find the same? So it's important to remember that's where it's coming from. And so Buddha was, in that sense, he was a physician. He was diagnosing the disease, which is our experience of dukkha. And he was looking in his little goodie bag to find the particular flavor of medicine, the particular prescription that would be useful for individuals. That's what he was doing. And the root of the teaching actually is not a path to freedom. There is a path, not denying the path. It's important there's a path. But the root of the teaching is you are already free. This comes through very strongly in the Chan tradition and is echoed in Zen and some other East Asian practices, but it's there in the earliest teachings, and I'll bring that out. But you are already free. It's your ignorance that gets in the way, your failure to see clearly that gets in the way of this natural freedom that is what we really are. So we've just got to see that. That's why it's a path of realization, not a path of gaining. It's realizing what's already true, not gaining something. All right. So in India, northern India at the time of the Buddha, he was teaching in a time when the Sanatana Dharma, which we call Hinduism, was emerging, was being imported and evolving. And at the same time, the Advaita teachings, the Upanishads, and broadly the Upanishads, but the non-dual teachings associated with that broad body of the Sanatana Dharma were evolving. And a whole bunch of other traditions were emerging, that most of which have faded away, but Jainism is still there. And so, it was a very rich time. At the center of all of those practices, all of those traditions, all of those religions and beliefs were the embedded idea of Atman. The release, moksha, is achieved by union with Atman. We can argue about what Atman is and say that you can't really define Atman and it's the same as Buddhist stuff and whatever, but linguistically, culturally, it was landed on this idea of Atman, and the realization is union with Atman. It was also in a cultural context where to engage in spiritual practice, people left home, went wandering around in the woods begging for food. There were naked dog ascetics who went around on all fours, barking, sniffing, and eating without using their hands. There were people who had all these what we would regard as very strange practices. But these are all practices of renunciation of, I've got to give this up in order to get this realization. So there's a directionality to this style of practices that informs how Buddha taught. Because yes, he was talking in opposition to some of those. He was talking about anatman, non-self, as opposed to self. When you think of anatman, we tend to think of that as non-self here, but it's also pointed at this bigger universal atman with which we're trying to gain union. That's not real either. So there's a bigger context for this anatman. But he was teaching within that milieu, albeit in opposition to some of the core tenets, but that's the language he needed to use. So the way the Pali Canon comes down to us is very much with this language of renounced desires. We've got to be rigorous in disciplining the senses. That's the cultural context for that language and for that approach to practice. Incredibly useful. It's not good, bad, or indifferent. It's incredibly useful. That's just how and why that particular approach emerges. India went south into Sri Lanka, and then Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos, so forth. And the flavor of India that went, the flavor of Buddhism that went in that direction really stayed closely in line with that traditional, what we call this, the Nikayas, the Pali Canon. There were different versions of the canon, but broadly that body of teaching is what went into Southern Asia. When Buddhism went north, however, something very different happened, which is really interesting and sets up what we see as a dichotomy, but it's just if you look at it in a cultural and a contextual sense, it's just really interesting. As around 500 years after the Buddha died, there was this emergence, and it was across all forms of Buddhism. If you went to Nalanda, which was the big university in northern India at the time, and some Chinese travelers did, and they documented their journeys. So this is like 700 CE. They were in Nalanda, and they said, wow, the diversity of Buddhist practitioners, all of these different ways, all of these different schools, all the same Vinaya, all the same monastic lineages, but this enormous diversity of teachings, and they're all just living together, cohabiting. It's great. No resistance. We see resistance in the diversity and dichotomy where at the time it wasn't seen that way. But there was this emerging idea of some of the classification systems of Buddhist teaching had landed on atomic natures of dharmas. So like the five senses were things, trying to reify them. And so an emerging school said, that's not true. And then we chant the Heart Sutra because of that. No eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. They're not things. These two are empty. So that was emerging. And this idea of it's not, the aspiration is not for our own liberation. The aspiration is to serve the liberation of all beings. The aspiration is not to wake up. The aspiration is to become a Buddha and help everybody else wake up. It's a shift in the aspiration. right? It's a different way of looking at the aspiration, because the two really aren't actually that different. They're just flavors. And it depends on personal tendencies. Some people, regardless of culture, regardless of the teachings, they're going to be more disposed to this more self-centered practice, and others are going to be more predisposed to work in community, just human nature. So it can get tangled up in ways that confuse us. But there was this emerging teaching, but I don't want to get caught up too much in that. What was happening around that, there are a whole bunch of other texts being written. The Lotus Sutra, all the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Lankavatara Sutra, the Tathagata Sutras, just this vast array of texts, Buddhist teachings with all these slightly different approaches to Buddhism were emerging at that time. All of these landed in China, along with the Nikayas, the Pali Canon, which in China are called the Agamas, in the period from like 200 to 500 CE. So it's like if a big dump truck came here and it just poured into this room, just this jumbled mess of CDs, for those of you who remember what those are. And you've got like classical music, Baroque music, 50s rock and roll, bit of hip hop. What? It's just a mess. How do you make sense of all of this? Because all of this is represented as this is just music, just like all of that was represented as this is just the Buddha's teaching. So in the period roughly 6th and 7th century China, there was a systematization going on of these teaching and a classification. At the same time, there's this teaching, which at that point was several hundred years old in China, was really maturing in China and being integrated into Chinese culture. So a couple of important things happen here. Thing one is Buddhism, when it lands in China, is landing in a place where there's a totally different philosophical, cultural understanding of the way the world is. The words in China are li and shi. Li is a principle. Shi is phenomenon. Li is essence. Shi is function. And think of the picture of yin and yang. These are not yin and yang, but it works the same way. Within yin, there's a dot, which is yang, interpenetrating yin. The two are not separable. Within yang, there is a dot, which is yin interpenetrating yang. The two cannot be separated. They must be kept in balance. If you get out of balance, you get a mess. Within your body, if your body is over yang or over yin, then there's problems happen. Same cultural. So the idea here, and this goes back, it predates Buddha by hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's there in Taoism, which was the native religion, one of the native religions when Buddhism arrived in China. It's there in Confucianism, Mencius. Just goes way, way back. The earliest writings have this approach. So within this, Li can only, or the principle can only be known through phenomena. And phenomena can only exist because of the principle. Function can only happen because of the essence, the original nature, the true nature. And the true nature can only be experienced and known through its function in the world. So these two just interpenetrate. So if you think of how these ideas of emptiness and form, which are very easy to see those as separate, the quest of the practice is to put down form and move into emptiness. Right? If you see how that structure works when it lands in China, it has to change because these two are actually integrated. So this is where this richness that we, if you read the Lotus Sutra of the Avatamsaka Sutra, there's flowers in the skies and all these myriad Buddha lands and crystal trees, and it's just extraordinary and extravagant because it's a way of describing the world we live in, because we can only, in that way of seeing the world, we can only wake up fully in the world because principle can only be known from within the experience of phenomena. It's not something other. So this is just simply to explain how this totally different approach, which is at its heart is teaching the same thing, already free. Here are a series of practices to help you see through your delusions, see through your vexations, but already free. That same core is there, but the framework within which it happens has shifted to fit the culture of China. And by extension, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, East Asia, which all was very much within that same cultural, philosophical worldview and approach to life, and also relied totally on the Chinese written language, classical Chinese, for its text. In the same way that Europe relied on Latin, East Asia relied on written Chinese. There's another branch of this which I don't know enough about, but I'll put it out there because it's part of the same story. Tibet. In northern India, in the first 500-700 years, so from around 300 CE to around 700 years CE, there was the emergence of tantric practice in northern India. And that pervaded religious traditions generally. And of course, therefore, it pervaded Buddhist teachings. So a lot of the Buddhist writings that emerged at that time, they include this tantric practice of transformation. So the Buddhism that landed in Tibet around 700 CE, because that's when Buddhism went to Tibet, is this tantric practice. And then you've got the Tibetan culture that took this in with the whole Burn tradition, and it became a very Tibetan thing. So the teachings that emerged in Tibet were a different set, or a different flavor. Again, the same heart, the same basic premise, but a different flavor. So, when I was in, I won't go there. We'll go to Tian Tai. Tian Tai was a system that emerged in China. One of the great systematizers of Buddhism in China was a guy by the name of Ji Yi. His dates, I think, were 538 to 597 CE. So it gives you a sense of when this was happening. He was one of the great, if not the greatest, of the synthesizers. The Tian Tai tradition later in Japan became Tendai, and in early 13th century, late 12th, early 13th century Japan, over like a 50 or 60-year period, there were 4 different Tendai monks who all left the Tendai tradition, went off and founded different things. One of them was Dogen. And so he founded Soto Zen. Another one was a guy who founded the whole Nichiren, this Pure Land tradition. Another one founded the Rinzai Zen tradition. These were all founded around the same time out of Tendai, which had become more esoteric, but was really rooted in this Tiantai system, this broad system. So Ji Yi, what he did, he looked at this truckload of stuff that had landed, and he broke it down into baskets. He said, well, there's this basket, which is the Agamas or the Nikayas. There's this basket, which is early Prajna Paramita. There's this basket, and then there's the Lotus Sutra is the 5th basket, which is the perfect teaching. Now, the reason he named it the perfect teaching is directly relevant to what we do here and how I think we should be approaching this here, which broadly is how we're approaching it here. He named it the perfect teaching, not because the teachings that he derived from the Lotus Sutra were in any way superior to any other teachings. Quite the opposite. What he said was, the Lotus Sutra is the perfect teaching because in the Lotus Sutra, what the Buddha expressly says again and again and again and again is, all of my teachings are simply expedient means. There is actually only one truth. There is only one teaching, and it is the teaching of liberation. Period. All of these other teachings are simply expedient means that are designed for people, time, place to meet people where they are, to help them into this single teaching of liberation. That's what GE was assembling. So underneath that fivefold structure of the teachings, he created a fourfold doctrine of conversion and fourfold method of conversion, which is exactly how a physician would work. The fourfold doctrine is the diagnosis. What are the conditions? What is the particular flavor of suffering that is being met by individuals or communities? And the fourfold method of conversion is the prescription. Having seen the problem, here's the prescription. Some people, and this is literally the way Tiantai works, for some people, the Pali Canon, the Nikayas, is the medicine they need. That's it. And it's the medicine they will need for the entirety of their sickness until they wake up, until they are liberated. For some people, the Heart Sutra and the Prajnaparamita stuff, that's the medicine they need. And they will need to have that medicine for the whole time until they are cured. For some people who have strong karmic roots and a particular affinity with the teacher, the medicine they need is highly customized, and it is within the relationship with the teacher, which is why you see in Chan the idea of the teacher-student relationship becoming so important, and these koans emerge, which are these dialogues between teachers and students. Because the intimacy of that relationship, day by day by day, the teacher seeing what's going on with the student and poking them in just the right way, right? That's what that's about. This is this very specific medicine for individuals where there's that particular affinity in place. For some people, they start with the Nikayas, the Pali Canon, the Agamas, but after a period of time, they shift to something else because they've got what they need out of that, and it's time to change the medicine. Some people will start somewhere else and move to the Nikayas. Right? So that's the way Ji assembled this. And that's the perfect teaching. And it's a way of saying we chant in our 4 vows, Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. These are the Dharma gates. All of these different flavors of the teaching of the various Dharma gates. Another way of translating that is the Dharma is limitless. The Dharma, I'm forgetting the first. Bear with me just a second, see if I can remember. I can't remember the first part, but the second part is I vow to master them. And the I vow to master them, instead of vow to enter them, is from the perspective of being a bodhisattva in the world. I vow to master all of these teachings so that I can be able to identify the particular flavor of dukkha that is in front of me, and I can pick the right approach to help somebody. Only if I've mastered all of these teachings can I find the right one, not be just a one-trick pony. So that's a way of reading that particular vow. So that's a broad framework. So we come to the US and we have all of these different ways that the teaching is constructed based on different cultural and social contexts in different times in the world. So we come to the US, and the reason I wanted to go through this is to say, so now, what does that mean for us today? For our practice, individually, communally, and as we manifest it in the world? We've first got to look at context. And the context is how the US and how the modern world is structured and how that affects us, what particular flavor dukkha takes on within that, what particular flavor our vexations have as we show up in the world with the stress. What I'd like to do is have when I finish here, we'll have a conversation, see what else comes up. But the things that occur to me are, firstly, we have a culture here of very strong individualism, much more so, I would argue, than at any time in human history. And it's very much a Western thing. It's even if in Central and Eastern Asia, it's not in Africa. There's much more community orientation, even though there's greater individualization. The extent of is so great in the West, which means all our labels of personal identity, which can be really useful, but can also, if we hold on to them, become really harmful. The whole idea of therapy, which works in linear time and is designed to, I think this is a quote from Freud, it's to move us to a place of manageable misery, something like that, right? I mean, it was never intended to make us completely free. It's intended to help us to cope with the world. But this is how we approach the world. We have our stuff and we hold on to our stuff. And we have a culture that believes the more stuff we have and the more we satisfy our desires, the happier we'll be. That's what we're trained to believe. So this culture of individuality is an important part of what we're dealing with, that I think is a different place for these teachings to land. And it means we need to think about how we bring these teachings to land with that as one of the root causes of our vexations. Another one is the scientific worldview, which is just a belief system, folks. It's a useful belief system. Don't get me wrong, it's profoundly useful, but it is just a belief system. And if we're stuck in that belief system, we're not going to be finding a path to happiness within it. It's something that frames how we see and how we experience the world. So from within that framework, and it's also something that creates this subject-object polarization. Science, by its very nature, is objective, the way we've approached science. We put something out in front of us with language so that we can all see and talk about the same thing, objectively. So science amplifies this polarization. So how do Buddhist teachings evolve land? How can they be most usefully engaged with this scientific worldview? Social justice versus compassion. Social justice is real. I'm not sort of putting that aside and saying it's not important. It is really, really important. Really, really important. But there's an approach to it when we land on social justice as the way we approach it rather than compassion that, again, polarizes. These are bad people doing bad things to those people. We need to stop those people. Separation, polarization. This is a category of people who need to have this polarization, labeling. It's not emptying ourselves, opening our hearts, and really directly experiencing the suffering of others and being moved into that suffering from a place of truly relieving suffering. We're working within this set of labels and categories and the qualities of the different players in that space. So as I said, this is not to put social justice aside. It's really important, but it's rather to frame how we look at it and how it informs our approach to the world. In the Vimalakirti Sutra, Vimalakirti is this profoundly awakened householder who's sick. And the Buddha has all of his disciples and all of his bodhisattvas, and he said, we need to go see Vimalakirti. He's sick. Ananda, would you go see him? Oh, no, I can't go see him. Why not? Well, because last time I encountered him, I was giving this teaching, and he made me look stupid. He goes down all the list of his disciples and bodhisattvas, and Vimalakirti has just identified their own individual shortcomings, and so they're just embarrassed to go see him. Finally, Manjushri says, I'll go. It's like, oh, great. Everybody trails along and see they all room this kind of size, and you get chairs up in the sky, and the room expands, just like the TARDIS in Doctor Who, right? Time and relative dimension in space. And in that space, Vimalakirti, and he's sick. He later says, he's sick and he will remain sick as long as there is suffering in the world, because his sickness is precisely the sickness of all living beings, which is the bodhisattva. So he teaches about emptiness. And after he's taught about emptiness, Manjushri, bodhisattva of wisdom, says to him, okay, so with this teaching of emptiness, how can one practice compassion if everything's empty? And Vimalakirti says, it is precisely because everything's empty that we practice compassion. If everything wasn't empty, we couldn't, because we'd be stuck on ideas. If there's any residue of a me left, then that sense of a me, a sense of what's in it for me, how am I impacting, will be caught up in my act of compassion. So it will not be pure compassion. If there's any sense of a person out there, the same, I'll be trying to land on something, I'll be trying to change something. Cannot be true compassion. Can only be true compassion if it's completely open-hearted. And we experience this with our loved ones when we've got a sick child, a sick grandparent. Not always, but there are times when we're with them that we just move into this open-heartedness and we're just with this sick person. This is true compassion. Same is true in the Diamond Sutra. The Diamond Sutra again and again says, there are no beings to free. And because there are no beings to free, we free beings. Same thing. So this is the reason I land on our approach to social justice as being one of the important factors to frame how we bring Buddhist teachings forward in our practice. Bring Buddhist practices forward in our lives, I should say. Because it's an approach that has dualism wrapped deeply into it. The other one, which is probably the biggest of all of these, and it actually surrounds all of these, is we are so top heavy in this culture. We live so much in our heads and not in our bodies. The vast majority of people who have livelihood in this country have a livelihood that requires a lot of thinking, not a lot of doing. We spend so much time on our phones, on social media, texting, being caught by the cycle of news. So much time in our heads. And the way this system works, the body engages with the world, sends messages to the head, and then the head makes representations of the world. And if we live cleanly, if we live in a place of realization, we don't get caught by those representations. We recognize they're just useful representations, and they allow us to engage our bodies. There's one of the Pali Sutras, I forget the name of it, Bahia. That's the one where he came halfway across India to visit the Buddha. He said, Buddha was begging, and he said, teach me, Buddha, teach me. And no, I'm begging, teach me. Finally, okay. He said, so what do I need to know? He said, when there is seeing, there is just seeing. When there's hearing, there is just hearing. When there's cognizing, there is just cognizing. This is freedom. With this, you are not here, you are not there, you are not in between. Just this. The Chula Sunyata Sutta frames Chula Sunyata is the shorter sutra on emptiness. And it really frames how, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha approached this body of teachings. It starts off in the forest, aware of the forest. And then you put the forest to one side and you say, what's underneath the forest? The ground, which is the earth element. 4. Earth, water, fire, air. Earth element. So you meditate on the earth element. And then as you settle into the earth element, what's underneath the earth element? Space. Everything exists in space. Things can only exist in space. Space is a construct. It's not real, but things only exist in space. Underneath that is boundless space. Under that is boundless consciousness, nothingness, beyond perception and non-perception, circle all the way around. So you've got, you've let everything go. And each of this is a process. As I said, it's like, this is the cultural context there was put this down in order to get that. So you're always letting something into the background. You're putting down the forest in order to move into earth, putting down the earth in order to move into space. You put down the last layer, and what do? You come back, and this is what the Chula Sunyata Sutta says, you come back to the six senses, just the natural functioning of the six senses, unobstructed by our intellectualization, unobstructed by our cognitive processes. Cognition is in there. There's no selfing within that. So our tendency to intellectualize, to get caught in our thoughts, obstructs the natural functioning of the six senses and moves us into this realm where space and time exist as things, where our ideas take on substance. They have no substance. You look at your thoughts, folks. Where do they come from? Where do they go from? Where do they go to? They are free. They self-liberate. They're already free. There's nothing there. Try and find a hold of thought. Give me your thoughts. You can't. So this is the construct within which we land in our Buddhist practice. And I just glanced at the clock. I'm running long here, but I'll finish off. So how does this inform our practice? So I think the most important place it informs our practice is really the need for embodied practice, the need to come down from our heads to our bodies. This is why I have adopted from Guagu, who's the guy down in Tallahassee who I was with. I've adopted from him and been using for months now, this idea of this progressive relaxation as a foundational step in our practice. And the process that goes through, you start at the top of your head and you relax on down, letting the weight drop. And as the weight drops, your thoughts fade. Energy drops. Everything becomes centered deep in the body, deeply grounded. And as you build that as a habit, that becomes a habit you can adopt anytime, any place. Come down, ground. Be embodied. It's not just coming back into the body, which is a hackneyed phrase that can be used a lot. It's truly grounding, truly being in the body and experiencing the body. This is why I amplify this at the end by, part of it, there's another reason as well, but it's part of the reason to amplify that at the end by massaging, rubbing, and touching your body to amplify that sense contact. Remember, this is what's in the world. So truly embodied practice. And truly grounded practice. The deeper we are in our bodies, the lower we are in our bodies, the less reactive we are. There's something that shows up in the martial arts, which is very useful, which is if you place your attention like an inch below the navel and a couple of inches back, Tanden, Hara, Dantian, different cultures call it different things, East Asian cultures. But the idea is this, if you place your attention and your energy here, you're much more stable. So if you're going into a difficult situation, take a couple of minutes beforehand to drop your energy here, you're going to be less reactive, less flighty. You can go further, though. If you drop your weight down to your feet, you're even more grounded. The lower you drop your weight, the more grounded, the more stable, the less reactive, and the more compassionate you are. And the second thing, and it's not an accident, the second thing is compassion, Brahmaviharas, metta practice, that kind of stuff. And so this is not an original thought. It's not an accident that when the crowd came back, Cornfield, Salzburg, Green, what's his name? Green? Cornfield. No, not Cornfield, Greenstein? Goldstein. Thank you. Goldstein. So when they all came back, in the 60s and 70s, there was this like traveling around Southern Asia. And when this group of people came back and founded the Insight tradition, very quickly they brought metta practice to be front and center in that. And they did so, number one, because it is an embodying practice. It's done properly, it's an embodied practice. And number two, because it's moving us into open-hearted compassion, away from labeling, from you're one of these, so you need this. You're one of those, so you need this. You're a something, so you need this. It's moving away from this classification and this box-oriented approach to social justice to an open-hearted, more intentionally compassionate approach. So there's two broad categories. And I'll talk more about this going forward, and we'll talk more about this as a community. But the things that I want to leave us with are, number one, a very broad recognition of the importance of knowledge, of acknowledging the cultural context within which certain Buddhist teachings arise, to recognize what they're trying to do, why they emerged. Secondly, to recognize that actually gives us a really, really rich array of different approaches to Buddhism and different Buddhist practices that we can take advantage of. And then thirdly, the importance of saying, okay, so given all of that, where are we right now? What is our current cultural context? What is my personal situation? What is the right prescription for me right now? What of these teachings are the right teachings to be drawing? Recognizing the commonalities across them all, but also recognizing the nuances that talk to different conditions, different flavors of vexation. So that finish and invite probably fairly short conversation, but conversation nonetheless.